So now let's get back to my waterfall model and start with the user needs. We tend to think of user needs. We say, what's the use of the product? And whether I think of the patient or whether I'm thinking of the healthcare provider, home healthcare, clinical nurse practitioner, whatever, if it could be somebody using the product on a patient or it could be the patient themselves, we tend to think of those things, direct use of it. But there are many other areas impacting user needs. Manufacturing is a user because they have to be able to make this. Regulatory affairs and quality assurance, quality control are users because they have requirements that speak to regulatory needs and to consistency needs for quality. You have consensus standards from regulators, from public health groups. So anything that has to do with the things that should be considered during your design, those are all part of your user needs. They're all, and what are they all based on? They're all failures or risks from previous designs have to be considered. So we make sure we make a good product out of this. Let's look at design inputs, the next one on our model. Now I'm going to stop and take a little bit of time here because this is a very important intersection between the two processes. ISO 14971 prioritizes the ways of doing mitigations, controls. You have to do these in order. You can't just put on labeling. So let's go through these. You have to start by trying to have an inherently safe design. If that doesn't work, or if it works partially, then what are the protective measures can you build around it? Then any residual risks that are left over, that's where I come in with labeling. And I put in its warnings, its safety alerts, its instructions for use, its training materials. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples now. Let's say my intent is to avoid unnecessary needle sticks in the hospital because everybody knows we can pass diseases with that. So if I want to do an inherently safe design, I'd go with a needleless connector. Connectors in between IV lines and IV bags. You now have a number of needleless connectors. Twist, they break a seal, and they have open flow. That would be a design. Now, some of the features, you can't get rid of the needle. If I've got to do a venipuncture to deliver a solution intravenously, then I'm pretty much going to need a needle to get in there. So then maybe what I have to do is put a protective measure around that. Needle shield, a needle guard. So something that opens up and protects the needle when it's not actually going through the patient's skin. That way, the whoever is there, the nurse, the phlebotomist, whoever, doesn't have an exposed needle that they can stick themselves with. That would be a protective measure. The last one talks about all of your instructions, including in your IFUs, you're going to have a thing about be sure you throw this away in a sharps bin so nobody down the road can get stuck by this needle by playing around with it. So you always have to follow this. This is a clear intersection point where you can see where your inputs and your risk management are just intimately interwoven. Every risk, every potential hazard that you identify must be addressed by at least one design input. So this is a critical point. When I go from design inputs, I go through the design phase, and I've now made my products. Design outputs is the characterization and the listing of all the characteristics of my product. It's the basis of creating manufacturing specs. we do trace matrices of these to make sure the outputs match the inputs, to make sure that the use of the product in human validation trials actually match the user needs that we wanted. So these are put together, and it's an iterative process. The goal of 14971 is to reduce risks as far as possible without adversely affecting the benefit risk ratio. If you have SOPs that have different wording and may say something about as far as reduce risk as far as practical or as far as possible, some other phrases, sometimes they were just abbreviated ALARP, ALARP. Those are no longer valid. That is an old version of 14971. The new version, this is the wording. You have to keep trying to reduce the risk. But they say there is a limit. There's a benefit risk level where you say the risk is acceptable. It's never going to be zero, and the benefit of this far outweighs that. So there is a limit, but check your wording in your SOPs to make sure you're following the current version.